Good afternoon. I am taking you on a trip to Atlantic Canada after 1632. There we find a French community different from the ones that came later to New France that we know today as Quebec and supervised by the French royal administration. The French family we are discussing are referred to as Acadians. They settled first in the Bay of Fundy near Port-Royal. Over time, and after conflict between French and British, Acadians will move several times in Nova Scotia until the end of the French colonial adventure in Atlantic in the French fortress of Louisbourg in 1758. These farmers were often recently married couples. They came mainly from the west of France and knew the ocean very well. They met the indigenous Mi'kmaq who had been living in the area for centuries. Relations with them were excellent. They shared the land, tradition, food, and knowledge. The French had to care for the cattle, seeds, and supplies they had brought with them by boat. And the French women had to find new ways to feed the household. This first job for the men was to drive the salted marshes. That meant creating land on the ocean. Courageously, year after year, they drained thousands of acres, thanks to a clever system of dike, the aboiteau, and eventually made these lands extremely fertile and prosperous. Each family owned a piece of land, but the work and responsibility was collective. The big difference was that the climate was harsher than in France and the tides very high. So they were able to sow and harvest grain, hay, and vegetables, which they would use to feed the livestock, feed themselves, and protect the crops. The grain they grew included wheat, flax, barley, oats, rye, buckwheat, hemp. Half of grain was wheat for making flour and then for bread. Years later, Louisbourg will encounter a different problem because there the land was very poor and not good for growing grain. People would have to wait for supplies to arrive by boat, which was unreliable, and the flour often arrived moldy. The Acadians built themselves houses out of wood and mud, which they located on the heights so as to not to be flooded. You can see the clay oven, which kept the heat longer. Each house had a vegetable garden too. While the men were busy in the fields, the women looked after the house, kept the fire going from very early in the morning until very late at night, cooked the meals, baked bread in the oven, and looked after the garden. They had to get water and do the laundry. And they had to take care of the children. And after a few years, there were a lot of them. There were also orchards. Each family owned 16 fruit trees, mainly apple trees and some pear trees. In any case, apple cider has remained very popular over time. As for vegetables, they included peas, meaning broad beans and beans. They were very popular because they were very nutritious. They also grew cabbage, large light green cabbage, smooth with broad leaves, and a lot of roots vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets, Jerusalem artichokes. Before winter, the cabbage were cut, turned over, left in the fields, and covered with hay. The snow cover preserved them until spring. There were also herbs like sarriette, Acadian summer savory, and especially green onions, which the woman used to produce a famous Acadian condiment, the RWSA, salted herbs. Meat was the mainstay of the Acadian diet. Each farm had cattle. First, there was pork. This coarse meat good for the people, as they used to say in France at that time. Pork had a distinctive flavor for the French in comparison with the British, because for the French, the pig was a domestic animal and ate like the family. The British pig was wild and stayed in the forest. The pig was easy to preserve, and the French ate every part of it. The ham in brine or the pork shoulder to smoke in the fireplace. The salted bacon was also good, boiled in the soup or made into thin grilled slices to add to any dish. The slaughter was a time for family to feast and to eat the fresh part that could not be preserved, like the boudin, blood sausage, and the head cheese. Hens, chicken, ducks, and geese were known to have not very tender flesh. The wild ones were tastier and tender because they ran freely. The women kept the poultry for eggs, and only the old hens were eaten after a long cooking time. In that era, cattle were smaller. Cows gave 6 liters of milk per day compared to 20 today. But it was difficult to store the milk, so part of it was drunk and the other part was saved to make butter and cheese. The butter was salted for better preservation. Its taste was already a little salty because the cows ate salted grass of the marshes. The cream rose to the surface and was churned, then rinsed, and finally molded. Butter was kept in the brine for the winter, and the women also made cheese, as they did in France, depending on the season, of course. The Acadians didn't like mutton. They said it tasted like wool, and so they kept sheep for the wool and for the hide later. And there was also no way they would eat horse, the friends of humans, and too noble to be eaten. So to complete their diet, they also started fishing and hunting. Fish were found in abundance everywhere in the Bay of Fundy. Brook trout, salmon, eels, and of course cod, depending on the season. Whiting, smelt, and herring will be added to the diet over the time and as the Acadian moved, plus shellfish and lobsters. For a long time, the cod has been the prominent fish in the North Atlantic. That will be even more the case in the future Louisbourg period because of the location. Cod has always been a delicacy for Acadians, having lean flesh, but being rich in protein and easy to keep, salted and dried. In addition, it became a symbol of fasting and of Christianity because the Catholic religion required lean days without meat for half of the year. Religion was central to Acadian life and a guide to running a family. So the French also began hunting. That was brand new for them because in France, hunting was reserved for the elite. The Micmac, who were nomads, had always preferred hunting and fishing, but the fur trade that started in the previous period had exhausted the big game resource. So they went rather to small game birds, bustard, ducks, partridge, wildfowl, turtle dove, and the French did the same. The Micmac dried meat and eel in Funson, then smoked them for preservation. They also introduced the French to squash, corn, and wild berries as well, and to maple sap. They used the sweet flower of maple in all food, including game. To concentrate it, they poured the sap into a birchwood container, froze it, removed the ice, and repeated the process again and again. The sap was sweet, but not the same as the syrup we know today. In exchange, the Micmac received from the Acadian salt, butter, and the cast iron pot or cauldron. The French always found the food of indigenous people very blunt because they didn't use salt. The interior of the Acadian home was simple. A large table for the whole family and a fireplace to keep warm. Keeping the fire was one of the women's tasks from sunrise to sunset. Preparing the meals was a straightforward as it was tedious. A single dish, but the mouths to feed could be very numerous. Acadians continue to eat as in their homeland. Simple but invigorating meals with a lot of meat because the cold and the very demanding work in the fields. The meal was cooked in large cast iron pot in the fire, and it was hard for the woman to push and pull them. First, the bread. Bread was the basis of all daily food in Acadia as in France already. Almost 2 pounds of bread per person per day. For the dishes, there was no cookbooks. Few people knew how to read, so the recipes were passed from mother to daughter. They cooked to taste and smell. The recipes were simple, like cod, for example, cooked in the simplest way to keep its best taste, boiled, a few salt herbs. That's it. The woman made soup with all kinds of grains, like barley, which was very popular, plus pieces of meat, or even just a big bone, according to your means, which will stay for days and days in the pot in order to get all the gelatin and nutrients. Not forgetting the large slice of bread. On them, the soup was poor. Some soup had very colorful names. The soup of everything, because the cook put in everything she had on hand. The front door soup, because the vegetable garden was close to the door. The All Saints' Day soup, traditionally with cabbage and turnips. The fricot comes from the very beginning of the colony, fricassé, sauté. Some pieces of game's burned in lard, water to make a broth, then add small pieces of vegetables, then small balls of flour dough and salted herbs. It can be made with fish and shellfish, then called chaude or chaude from the word chaudron, cauldron. Adding slices of broiled salted lard was common. Ragout, stew, would later be found in Louisbourg, corresponding to more sophisticated dishes on the table of aristocrat and wealthy merchant. Salted herbs were green leaves preserved in salt. Sometimes the woman added a few small pieces of the white part of onion. Each family had its own variation of the recipe, as for many preparations. No pastries at this period, but the woman created some sweet touches with wild berries foraged in the forest, raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, cranberries, fresh or dried. Some slice of melon poached in maple sap, and dry apple slices, which they kept in the attic. Walnuts, very sweet, were collected in the fall. They were very popular, dried, but also delicious raw or cooked, a good addition to dishes made from grains. About drinks, there was not really wine or strong spirit. Also, some rum did arrive in Louisbourg due to trade with the West Indies. Keep in mind the cider already mentioned, and the Acadian very famous for beer made of spruce buds, la bière d'épinette, spruce beer. The Acadian, being isolated from the other French in North America, created a unique community very early. Family became the most important social unit before any administration developed. And this strong identity has continued to this day among those descendants from the early Acadians. I suggest some places you might like to visit in future to learn more about Acadian history, to meet them, and to share their legendary joie de vivre.